Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Welcome back for another glorious edition of Ask That. My name is Clark Sell, your host and just general dude. Today, I have with me Ashley Dzick. We are going to talk about user experience and more importantly, the kind of the accessibility around it. Where do we think the industry's going? Where do we think we're going? And we'll just have a very user-centric conversation about user experience. Ashley, before we start talking today, why don't you tell everybody who you are?
My name is Ashley Dzick. I am the founder of Varsity UX, which is Milwaukee's kind of meetup group user experience. We're about 500 people and growing pretty quickly, so that's exciting. I am an adjunct professor at Milwaukee School of Engineering. Right now I'm working with them on building out their user experience curriculum. We're actually pretty much throwing out what they have and completely starting over. Pretty big focus on product design, AI, a bunch of other stuff that I'm pretty excited about. And then apart from those two things, I am also a UX consultant. Generally speaking, I work a lot around accessibility, a lot around design, some user experience strategy. So it's been pretty exciting to kind of see all of these different companies in the Metro Milwaukee area really come together and start forming these much larger user experience teams, some of which for the first time.
Yeah, so you've got your hands in a lot. You remind me of me, kind of smattered in everything.
Yeah, I definitely have read a couple of asks or watched a couple Ask That's about time management and productivity.
Yeah. I think we could do a whole nother show just on trying to manage one's time. So let's start to break that down. So I guess let's start with, why do you think that there's been such a kind of resurgence with UX around the area? And do you think that that's just centralized to here in the Midwest, or is that like an industry-wide type trend?
It's actually kind of the reverse. I mean, it's followed the same sort of product development, and or software development in general, where you see it mostly on the coast and then it ends up coming to the Midwest. So we're definitely a little behind in that aspect. If you look at some of the larger corporations in the Milwaukee area, like the Johnson Controls and Kohl's and Northwestern Mutuals of the world, they've had a UX team for some of them for 20 years. But then I look at some of the other large companies in the area and they've had a UX team for one or two. And why I think that's happening, I think that it's not enough to have a product anymore. It's not enough to just show up. Just because you have an e-commerce site or a physical product or whatever you're designing doesn't necessarily mean that users are going to want to use it. They have the choice now. And so some of that is marketing, but ultimately, if I have two products that I'm looking at and one is maybe $15 more, but I don't have to think about it, I don't have to spend energy really learning how to use it, I'm going to go with that one.
Yeah. Do you think, those who have had a UX team kind of around for a while, do you think their focus has shifted from maybe more of a marketing role and that very client-centric side to not just that, but also being integrated deeply with the software development side?
Yeah, I've actually seen it kind of that way, but I've also seen it where marketing has always been completely agnostic of the developer teams. I mean, I, as a former software developer, can definitely equate to, the marketing team, the salespeople all of a sudden go out and sell something that we don't have, that we don't understand, and now we have to figure out how to do it. So actually having a little bit of that integration with user experience has been helpful, because that's one more step, one more person who's kind of in the way of saying, hey, before we go out and spend, $100,000, $200,000 of our developers' time, let's actually go through and validate this a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are also some in the reverse, to your point, where having some of that user experience more embedded in the developer team, I think has really gotten to a point where now you've got a lot more collaboration, a lot more chance to learn from one another that you really just didn't have before.
Well, and what does integration really look like? I mean, are we just flinging wireframes over the sides, or are we actually trying to team together to solve, goals?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends on the size of the team and also the interest of the developers. But some of the most successful products I've been on, yes, we gave them wireframes, but they had a lot of the interaction pieces already thought out. They were able to fill that in. And then any sort of user testing, I absolutely love trying to get developers involved in any sort of user testing, because a lot of times they have insights and a direction, an approach that I might have my own cognitive bias that doesn't allow me to see it. So kind of getting just another technical opinion in there a lot of times is helpful in that product viability stage. And also, you're going to build something that is actually buildable.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You mentioned accessibility when it comes to UX, and you had a few different definitions around it. Like, let's start to dive into that. I think when we hear accessibility, we always think about, high contrast and just being more accessible for more people.
There is a couple different concepts around it. Accessibility is really the traditional approach. When you start to think more outside of that, though, the term that Microsoft is using a lot is called, inclusive design. There we go. But there's the idea of you're not necessarily just designing for the colorblind person. You're not designing for somebody without a permanent disability. Everything that you do for any sort of accessibility or inclusive design has a further impact. So Microsoft's inclusive design, for example, they talk a lot about people who have to operate a mobile app, just as an example, and they've only got one arm. Well, there's not that many people who lose a limb every year. But if you expand that to think about how many people who break an arm or who have sprained something, they can't use that hand, or they're working from home and they're holding a baby, or they're, working with a power tool, whatever it is, they can't use both hands in that instance. So it's really the concept of learning when your users are using your product and why, and then starting to design to those limitations. And the benefit of that is that if somebody does have that permanent disability, then yes, it's going to work for them too. And obviously we always want to keep those people in mind, but the majority of your audience, in the case of missing limbs, probably are going to have both arms. They probably aren't going to be colorblind. But just because you shouldn't just ignore them, but also designing something like colorblindness, for example, that doesn't just work for people who are colorblind. If you're in a situation that's low contrast, if you're outside, a lot of these things kind of really relate across the board.
Yeah. I always tell a story. This is many years ago when, the mobile apps are starting out, and one was talking to a person who was super, super excited. They were getting ready to flip the bit. They had gone through all their testing and development. And he shows me this great app, and it's got this control, and they're just so proud of this thing. And my wife's left-handed, so I've gotten in the habit of like taking the phone with the left hand and seeing how it would work, right? And of course, the control was made for somebody with the right hand, and I said, "So can you just kind of flip the controls around?" And he goes, "Well, no. Why would you want to do that?" I was like, "Left-handed wife, like, just doesn't really work."
There's some weird statistic. I don't remember the exact number, but it's around a dozen left-handed people die every year using something that was made for right-handed people.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Carrie always gives us the story of, had to use the right-handed scissors in school or this or that, but they're left-handed.
The right-handed desks.
What's that?
The right-handed desks. You remember the old school desks where
right, totally. Yeah.
We're all right-handed.
Yeah. I never even thought about that. Damn desks. So how then does a team really balance involving that? I mean, there's a lot of skills there involved. And if you have a small team, how do you then start to incorporate that kind of stuff, I guess, pragmatically, such that you're still pushing, the ball forward, but yet becoming an overall a better design?
Right. So I'm all for Agile, especially in user experience. If you try and tackle all of this at one time, it's going to be a huge overtaking. Just starting to identify key segments that you either might be missing or could really help, and then just tackling them as an iterative approach, one at a time, or if it's 2-week sprints, 4-week sprints, whatever they are, you can start to just sort of build in that cadence. And then when you're starting to build that more as an agile cadence, then instead of having to come back and fix it, the idea being that over time you kind of learn what to identify, you learn what to fix, so that when you do it the first time, on a new product or redesign or whatever, you don't have to go back and then say, okay, well, now I'm going to look at it for somebody with colorblindness. I just know to look at that from the beginning.
Sure. And if you were to just what's the things that just bug you? You're out on a site or some experience, whatever, and it's very obvious to you, but may not be to me or somebody else.
Yeah, so my big thing right now is that I think there's some very, very gorgeous websites out there that I have absolutely no idea how to use. I mean, they have taken away a lot of, and I mean, I'm not necessarily advocating for all links being blue and underlined and all text being
Sure.
black, all websites being white, but there is a certain usability, there's a certain ease to it that if you look at especially some of the marketing websites today, you try and figure out how to use it. There's no, I don't know if this is a link or a header. You have no header structure at all. I mean, it looks great. It looks fantastic.
Right.
I want to print it out and put it on my fridge. I just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's certainly, yeah. Don't make your users work.
Right. Yeah, I'd rather have something that is consistently, I don't want to say consistently terrible, but consistently not exciting, because then they only have to learn how to use it once. If some of your pages are fantastic, some of them are terrible, then they have to rethink, we have to relearn everything. You'll see this a lot when there's a fantastic, shiny marketing website, and then you come into the actual product and it clearly hasn't been updated in 10 years, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, that looks so fantastic, now I have to figure out a whole other thing.
Yeah. Where's the line of like, obvious use versus training a user? I mean, we have sites now that have like nice overlays and guided do this, do that, the other. Is that a smell of somebody who just hasn't spent enough time doing their homework?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an easy way to train people, but you shouldn't have to train somebody how to use it. If your icons aren't descriptive enough that you have to tell me every single time what the icon means, maybe instead of using the icon, you should just use a word. The same thing goes for a lot of workflows. If I have to go through and remember what 18 things are, if I need some sort of overlay or training guide, it might just be too much on one page. It might not be simplistic enough, or it might not be detailed enough. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a shiv to try and fix a problem without actually having to fix it.
Sure. And then, taking that, since we do live in this global world, global economy type place, how do you balance, I should say balance, how do you incorporate the global side of things, the different cultures and all that into your UX?
A huge undertaking. So one thing you don't do, so we are obviously a left to right language. Because of that, we read, left to right and then down. I've seen a couple websites where you do have right to left languages, and what they'll do is they'll just flip it. But there's a lot of different design patterns, a lot of different design systems for, in each culture, each language. Something designed one way might mean a completely different thing in another country. So it is definitely a hard to tackle approach. I don't have a great answer for you there, other than if it's really important that your app works in China, then you're going to have to actually design it to work in China. You can't just cheat. I mean, you can, but then again, the one that's easier to use for these, your Chinese patron might then go with something natively designed by, people who understand the same design systems that they have.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I mean, you're heavily involved in the design community around Milwaukee, and what does that look like from a community standpoint? Are we starting to break down some of these silos between developers, designers, I don't know, doers, practitioners?
Yeah. So our meetups usually are only about a third actual dedicated user experience professionals. There's some people who are interested, but then we also do get a decent amount of developers who are looking to not even necessarily get into UX, but they're trying to understand more. I think that's a really important thing, especially in the age of there's so many meetups in pretty much any technology. Just being able to build some of that, even if you don't completely understand the technology. I'm not going to turn around and try and build something in React or Angular, but I also understand the importance of knowing how it works and to design for it.
Sure.
So I think because of that, there is a little bit more, it's not necessarily paired programming, but paired co-working to try and figure that out. But also I think there's more and more frameworks that are pretty vetted, pretty tested. I mean, at one point we just had Bootstrap. Now we've got a plentiful amount of Bootstrap competitors. But all of these are getting better in their approach. They're getting more consistent. And a lot of times you can get something 90% of the way there without even really involving a UX person. So then that kind of comes up with, well, then where does the value in your UX person even live, you can get so close to there. And I think then it becomes more of an educational piece and really just trying to figure out who you're even designing for.
Yeah, sure. So, taking it back to I want to get back into those tools in a second, but, what do you think we can do as just an overarching community to better integrate one another?
Yeah, so I've actually been to a couple of clients, and unfortunately, there was definitely a walled approach.
Yep.
It was the user experience people would throw something over to the developers. They would implement it 70, 80% of the way. And I don't know if that's just because it was an unfeasible design or if they didn't have time. There was never that
Sure.
discussion. And then they would have an argument there, and they would move on to the next project. So I think really just bringing that collaboration piece a lot earlier. So if you are designing something where you're going to hand it off to another team, the time to discuss it with them isn't, I am done with this and moving on to a new project tomorrow. The goal is to get them involved, even if it's just a little bit in the beginning, so they can actually understand the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
So that they could potentially have some sort of influence. They could help you find any sort of mistakes, things you might have missed. Obviously, other people are going to have a different technical background, a different experience with the users, but it's really just getting involved earlier. And that's not necessarily to say that as a UX professional, they would need to get their design vetted by every single developer who could potentially touch it. But they should at least allow that option if somebody does actually want to come through and look at it and ask questions.
Yeah. We have the same problem on the other end of the spectrum, right? You have the infrastructure guys or the I hate calling them the DevOps folks, but they have requirements, they have needs, they have an infrastructure design and layout and requirements, and like UX, when that holistic team is involved earlier, the better, right?
Right.
It's like writing any unit test, right? If you can make it fail first and then implement it, then that it's going to work. And but I do get concerned. It's one of the things that for that conference we've always tried to have a very balanced, polyglot community of people who span all kind of walks of something in software development, and that could be education to a designer to a developer to a DevOps person. And I worry at times with all of the meetups and communities, and I get it, we always have to have a niche, but it's the kind of coming back together and sharing those stories that we can take back to our places of work in business, because in some cases, the big shops who have the money for the design team also have an organization that doesn't necessarily have that. They're either a shared resource that are used across all the different teams. And then you have the smaller shops, which are just act as usually a unified team, which is good, but they have less resources. So, it's a thing that keeps me up quite a bit.
Yeah, I did notice, especially on that conference lineup this year, there were two things I noticed. One is that there's actually, I think, 3 different talks on accessibility, which is exciting. It's something that I am passionate about, and I'm interested to see those talks. I actually gave an accessibility talk at that conference last year, kind of a different angle though. And then also just getting some of the user experience and developers or any other team together. You don't necessarily always just have to have the talks for each of them. You don't have to check every single box, but getting people to attend meetups together or attend that conference together to actually bring that, even if it's not structured collaboration, even if it's not structured storytelling, you can't really ever have that communication if they're never in the same room.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess just as a community, we have to do better of creating rooms, be it either physical or virtual, where we are open to sharing across those boundaries. There's too much going on today to not need to leverage one another in these places. Which brings me to the tools, right? So where for you do these tools? Where are they good, evil, and how has it changed? Where you think of yourself or others think of themselves, in regards to these tools.
Yeah, so there's kind of been an interesting, the pro and con of it, I guess, is that the fact that there are a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of ways to really piece together things very easily. We do end up with overall, I think, a net positive in that if everybody had to hand roll everything from scratch, you wouldn't have the consistency between pages. But yeah, so then you do end up in a situation where it's, okay, why do I need to bring in this person? Why do I even really need to do any sort of user analysis? I'm just doing this sort of basic website. So I think understanding really that the tools are there to be leveraged, but at the end of the day, you can't get around having another person. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, you don't have the resources, but I mean, even when I was working on my own personal portfolio, there were definitely times where I went out to some of my coworkers and was like, I could spend a week trying to figure this out, trying to figure out these tools, but I'd rather, work together. I'd rather learn from them. I'd rather get all set up in Cloudflare. So thanks, Bob, for that. And really then have that understanding that if I ever need it, in the future, I've got that.
Do these tools box us into more innovative solutions?
Yeah, so there was a tweet, and I'll have to find it, that somebody made last year. And he basically held up two pieces of paper in the tweet and said, which website is yours? The idea being that all websites have now become so similar that you can pick them up. And I mean, definitely because I work more in the design aspect, it's a little bit easier for me, but I can pull up a random marketing site and without looking at the source code, be able to very easily say, Bootstrap, no, that's definitely Squarespace. Oh, this one might have been designed a little bit more uniquely. But the downside there is that it definitely ends up in a situation where everything does kind of look and act the same.
So then how do you differentiate yourself in that world? Because that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, the service that you provide should be the thing that sticks out. And if, you have, I don't know, whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to, like to your point, right? It's a usable interface. I don't have to have the flashy thing. So how do you differentiate yourself in this?
I think it then becomes your content and your understanding of your user's situation. So there's a theory that someone pointed me out to last week that's been around for a while that I really like. It's the theory of jobs to be done. And the idea is that if a user is going out and buying something, they're not going out and buying the components of it. What they're doing is they're buying something that's helping them to do some sort of job in their life.
Yep.
So this example is like a skateboard. You're not going out and buying a skateboard because you want wheels and a deck and everything else. You're buying it because you enjoy skateboarding or you want to get somewhere faster.
Yep.
So I think really then taking your website and realizing that it's just a conduit, or your app or whatever product it is. It's just a conduit to try and get your delivery of information, your unique spin on how you're going to help this user live a, more meaningful, purpose-driven, or just easier life.
Yeah, for sure. Going back to what you originally started, you work at the college there,
Milwaukee School of Engineering.
Yeah, and how do you think that design and all that has changed that? I don't want to say generation, but I guess education today in the larger sense of computer science.
So Milwaukee School of Engineering is actually kind of interesting. So I went there for my undergrad, and at the time they didn't actually have a computer science degree. They had a software engineering degree and they had a computer engineering degree, amongst others. And the idea was that they're not going to do computer science. And here's the list of 18 reasons why they're so much better than computer science. And unfortunately,
built on Bootstrap.
Well, so I recognize this in myself too. 19 years old, realizing that, or not realizing, wish I would have realized at 19, but there's builds a sort of sense that you end up in a situation where you are untouchable engineer, and if the users can't figure it out, it's because they're too dumb to figure it out. It's not my fault, it's your fault. And MSOE had a technical communication degree, but it was very much around writing manuals and documents, and they were different classes. They never really had any interaction, but they're also physically in a different building that very few engineers actually ever went into. So you end up in these situations where it was building walls. So now they have a computer science degree, they have a kind of a focus on artificial intelligence, which I think will be interesting to see what happens with that. But also as we're designing this curriculum, we're still making them take some of the classes that a computer science or software engineer might have to take. So we debated for a long time, for example, if they're going to have to take software development 1. It's just a basic Java data structures class.
Sure.
Realistically, is a UX person ever going to use data structures? Probably not.
Well,
But
they use it in the visual interface, though. I mean, like to knowing just a little bit about the plumbing underneath the sink,
yeah.
you know that how this somewhat carries on the screen is important.
Our goal was to force them to get into a class and learn from software people to have to really work together. And it's been interesting to see that myself and the other professors have really been trying to drive more of that collaboration between the team or groups, and especially in the computer and software engineering groups, they've been really cognizant that they had a gap around some of that user analysis, and so they're debating taking a couple of our classes and making them a required piece in theirs.
Interesting.
So just building that collaboration from a collegiate level has been really interesting. And these students are far more design, even the ones who aren't in the UX program are far more design savvy, far more computer savvy than even just some of my coworkers or colleagues when I was attending that school. I mean, they're coming up in an era where they understand the need for some of these design pieces, either because they've had a really bad experience or they just understand that, hey, this is what is helping.
I think we're also in an era where, because there is so much choice, if you just take apps on the mobile phone, the ones who have really succeeded are the ones who have really focused on the user experience, because they realize that the attention, they're trying to garner one's attention. If not done well, then you will not be successful, because they will just delete it and move on to the next thing. And you have to manage that attention. It's
not just enough to be functional.
Right.
You have to actually, so there's a little pyramid that I was actually teaching in one of my classes this morning, where kind of the bottom was functional and then it became reliable. And I think those two are really important. Yep. Users will absolutely leave something if it's not reliable. But then the next you get into usable, which, again, if it's usable, great. But then after that, you really get into a sense of pleasurable. It has some sort of meaning to you. It's desirable to use. Way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that because it has meaning, that doesn't necessarily mean I feel like I'm changing the world with it. Mm-hmm. But my example there was SpaceX. So they have a huge following because that's meaningful to a lot of people, because they are deriving some sort of satisfaction over really seeing that the space program is not necessarily continuing as much through NASA, but now there's somebody else doing all these things, creating a sense of wonder in themselves and others around them, and doing stuff like putting a car in space.
Yeah. So if we're to fast forward now, and we're in this world of, you mentioned AI, we're in the world of, this, I'm going to say audio video boom, whether it's the home assistants, the Alexas, the Google Home Pods, whatever. Even to, the ability to do things in YouTube and other mediums. How do you think our UX will have changed or will look, in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I definitely we're getting away from designing for interfaces or traditional in front of you interfaces, more so towards natural language interfaces. There's also kind of an interesting aspect of actually determining around a lot of analytics, predictive analytics, machine learning. There's a lot of really interesting things that you can do there. It'll be interesting to see the implications of a lot of them, though. So there was a Target ad a couple years ago, and I'm not remembering all of the details. I can't remember if this teenager knew she was pregnant and hadn't told her parents, or didn't know or something. But based on habits, they mined that, and they went through and they were able to use all of their predictive analytics to start sending her targeted advertisements. Obviously kind of an extreme example, some other things going on around there, but that's one thing where should they have sent the advertisements? Do we, there's a whole thing around data security, privacy. Should we mine the data in the first place? And if we do want to use it, well, then how do we leverage this across all these channels? Do we leverage this, in that print ad? Do we leverage some of this in, your Google Home, Cortana, Alexa, Siri? All of a sudden you go from having 2 channels, 2 interfaces, web and mobile, to having a huge end-to-end experience across multiple platforms, and trying to maintain that consistency, and then also trying to figure out where that line is going to be interesting.
Yeah, I I tend to think that we are getting in a place where things are going to become exponentially harder when you actually have to be recognized in your app, your website, your Alexa, your this. Shut up, Alexa.
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
I know you're not. You know, you want this experience that works across all of them, either whether it's your devices in your house to, you know, your presence and how you move just in your day-to-day being, and then how you interact with your family and your family's kind of presence inside of it. So, I mean, our family of 4, I think of how they use our accounts and the TVs and everything that's there connected and the locks on the door. That experience, right, is drastically harder when you look at it from the collective view and not just, you know, hey, I'm going to my website for this thing. And I think it'd be interesting to see how these things are designed, because we're far from having something that's cohesive or good or...
Yeah, so with Alexa, for example, I mean, you not only have to go through and design all the voice interfaces for that, but you have to think about how they're going to work together. Are they going to fight? If you have Alexa and a Google Home and HomePod in the same room, how is that going to interact?
Yeah.
Also, then you start thinking about a little bit more about developmental psychology and how do you ensure that you develop an experience that's appropriate for children who might be around, while also still allowing, you know, adults to have meaningful interactions with it as well.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I mean, we have a device here that regulates our kids' internet time, and their world in school has grown up on computers, so iPads and Chromebooks and whatever, right? And so a lot of their homework and books is all over the internet. And yet a simple device that regulates one's time today has no concept of like needing an exception to do homework on said devices either. And it seems like such an obvious thing, but yet, you know, it's Disney and everybody else who's involved in this thing, and it's just completely missed the mark. And as a parent, it's frustrating, you know, just...
Yeah. So I think that is definitely an area where we're going to see a lot of growth soon. Actually, Alexa just announced, or not Alexa, Amazon just announced the little Echo Dots for kids.
For the kids.
Yeah, and they have a lot of things built in. They also think about the fact that especially small children aren't the most fragile, or treat things the most fragilely. So it comes already with this big bumper case, like an OtterBox for an Echo. And then they have some different interactions there. But even just treating it as adults versus small children, you're going to end up in a situation where inherently one child is going to understand how to do something better or be a little more advanced than another child. And then again, you get into, well, how do you develop for the, you know, use cases across children as well?
Yeah.
Especially when they're not the ones actually buying it, so you don't actually have that direct consumer feedback.
Right. And questionable whether or not they even need it in the first place. You know, are we short-circuiting them going through some developmental phase that they in fact should have on their own? And that's, you know, guess we'll find out when 20 years comes by and these kids don't actually know how to use a website to order anything. Damn kids.
I don't think that they will have to, though. I mean, I don't know if we'll need to use a website in 20 years to be able to order something either. I mean, there's some discussion around if children should be taught, like, cursive, for example, in school. And I mean, I am a huge proponent of cursive just because I find it personally easier to use. Does that mean I feel like it should absolutely be taught to everyone? I don't know. But we're kind of at an age right now where because people have learned how to use it before, it's all of a sudden a travesty that their children haven't been taught it. Personally, I don't know if that's meaningful to them or not. There's a lot of debate around it, but there's not an actual measurement or evidence quite yet.
Yep.
We haven't quite there.
My kids have gone through both of that. They've gone through, it's not a requirement to where they then did learn it, and now it's kind of an optional whether or not they can print or not print. And I saw with my daughter, she very much wanted to learn it, whereas my son just doesn't care. I mean, if we could get him to print legibly, like, that would be fantastic. And to your point, like, forcing him to write cursive is useless. it is getting him to write and be able to just do that act is fantastic. If it's in cursive, I mean, I could just care less. It's never going to work for him.
But that comes back to trying to teach your users or trying to help them have that end goal, that more fulfilling job to be done, whatever it is. Yeah. Cursive is just the tool in this case. Ultimately, the goal isn't cursive. It's, improved readability. He's at an age right now where your brain is still plastic, so he's going to learn way more now. This is the time where you learn all of those literacy pieces. Adult literacy is way harder, or to a gain, but just getting there, trying to enable that end user experience, whatever channel that is.
Yeah, for sure. Well, at the end of every one of these, I like to extend a bit of gratitude and acknowledge the other person, and you are certainly somebody that I would like to acknowledge for the tireless dedication that you have spent in the design community and running things and being active and involved. And I know that there's a lot of nights that goes by. I know, as you were talking about, your kids getting sick earlier and whatnot, I recognize how hard it is to live in all of those different segments and yet still try to push, I don't want to say the mission, but the passion forward. And so with that, thank you for the work that you've done.
Thank you for putting all this together.
Thank you. My last question, and it's one that I ask of everybody. How would you define community, and what does it mean to you?
So to me, community is really all of the meaningful people, I guess, in an immediate community, all the meaningful people that I can reach out to. I mean, sure, some of them are family, sure, some of them are friends, but even just having a strong mentoring network to me has been really valuable. There's somebody I just talked to about 2 weeks ago. I was contemplating potential job change situation. I didn't talk to him in probably 6 years, but since we still had some of that community, that shared experience, I was able to reach out and really get the advice of somebody I really value. So that's been really invaluable to me.
Love it. I've loved hearing every one of these answers. What's that?
I said it's a good question.
With that being said, folks, thank you for spending your time with us today. Give us a thumbs up if you've liked it. If you've disliked it, you'll need to just go reach out to our support team and they won't answer you at all. I'm just kidding. All being said, I'd love to know what tools you use. Drop them below. How do you feel like it's either worked with your creativity, not? Drop Ashley and I a note. We would love to engage on whatever medium you are on. Ashley, how do people find you?
Twitter, LinkedIn. I actually am on Medium. Either email.
Wherever. Well, we will put some info in the show notes. And with that being said, thank you, Ashley, for the time. And we will see everybody tomorrow.